You know, when we think about modern medicine, we picture all this high-tech stuff like robotic surgery, AI diagnostics, all that.
Right, something out of a sci-fi movie.
Exactly. But when you get down to the nitty-gritty of figuring out what infection is actually making you sick, it feels,
Mm.
well, it feels less like Star Trek and a lot more like an old detective novel.
It really does. It's gritty work. You're hunting for clues, you're looking for fingerprints at a crime scene, except your suspect is totally invisible.
And the stakes couldn't be higher. If you chase the wrong lead, the patient gets worse. So today, we're opening up the Detective's Handbook. We're doing a deep dive into Chapter 4 of Lippincott Illustrated Reviews. Microbiology, all about diagnostic microbiology.
And I know that title might sound a little dry,
Well, but yeah.
but this chapter is really the bridge. It connects a patient saying, I feel awful, to a doctor being able to say, here's the drug that will save you.
And the text lays it out as this narrowing path. I love that idea. We start broad, and we get more and more specific.
And there are basically 5 big methods to do that. You start with just looking at it, microscopy,
Then you try to grow it.
cultivation, yep. Then you can look for its badges, its antigens,
Or its DNA, its genetic code.
and finally, you can look for the body's response, the antibodies. It's a whole process of elimination. You have to know the enemy to pick the right weapon.
So let's start where the chapter starts. And surprisingly, that's not in the lab. It's in the exam room.
It has to be. The detective's notebook, the patient history. The best lab in the world is useless if you don't give it any context.
Right. If you just send a sample down labeled wound, what are they supposed to do?
They're just guessing. You need the clues from the patient's story. Some are really obvious, right? A cough points to the lungs. Pain with urination points to a UTI.
But then you get the really interesting ones, like travel history.
Oh, travel is a huge one. It completely changes the map of likely suspects. The book uses a classic example, swimming in the Nile River.
And if a patient tells you they just did that,
My brain immediately goes to schistosomiasis. I mean, I would never even think to test for that parasite if you told me you never left, say, Idaho.
it's like a filter. Same with occupation, right? The book mentions butchers.
Yep. A butcher with a fever. I'm thinking brucellosis. A farmer. Maybe anthrax. Their job tells you what they've likely been exposed to.
There was one variable in the text that was genuinely kind of scary to me, age. The meningitis example was eye-opening.
It is, and it's so clinically important.
Oh.
Okay, so you have a newborn with a stiff neck and fever. The most likely culprit is Streptococcus agalactiae, group B strep.
And the treatment for that is?
Usually penicillin G works great.
Okay. Now, same exact symptoms, stiff neck fever, but it's a 40-year-old man.
Totally different bug.
Yeah.
Now, the top suspect is Streptococcus pneumonia. And here's the problem.
It's resistant to penicillin.
Often, yes.
Okay.
So if you treat that 40-year-old with the same drug you used for the baby, the treatment could fail. For him, you need the big guns right away, maybe a cephalosporin or vancomycin.
And you have to make that call based on age, before the lab results are even back.
It's an educated guess, a probabilistic one. That's why the history is so critical.
Okay, so we've got our leads. Now we need hard evidence. Let's go to the lab. First up, direct visualization. Just looking at the thing.
Microscopy. The biggest advantage is speed. A culture can take days. A microscope gives you an answer in minutes.
And the star of this show is the Gram stain. Everyone's heard of it, but the book breaks it down so well, it's about their armor, isn't it?
That's the perfect analogy. It's all about the cell wall. So first, you hit the slide with crystal violet dye.
Everything turns purple.
Everything's purple. Then you add iodine, which is a mordant. It kind of locks that purple dye in place.
Then comes the most important part, the acetone, the decolorizer.
This is where the separation happens. Gram-positive bacteria have this thick, spongy cell wall. Think of it like a thick mesh. It just traps that purple dye. The acetone can't wash it out.
But the Gram negatives,
They have a really thin, flimsy wall. The acetone just strips that purple dye right out. They become invisible again.
which is why you need that final step, the safranin.
Right, the pink counterstain. The now naked Gram negatives soak that pink dye up. So you end up with purple bugs and pink bugs.
Gram positives are purple, Gram negatives are pink, and that simple difference is huge clinically. If you see pink little spheres in pairs from
Right.
a urethral sample.
Gram-negative diplococci. That is Neisseria gonorrhea until proven otherwise. You can start treatment for gonorrhea right then and there.
But not everything played by the rules, right? The book lists exceptions.
The weirdos, yeah. I mean, some bacteria like Mycoplasma don't even have a cell wall. You can't stain something that isn't there.
And others have waxy walls, like TB.
Exactly. Mycobacterium tuberculosis has this waxy, lipid-rich wall. The gram stain just slides right off. So for that, you need a special stain, the acid-fast stain.
And what does that look like?
It's unmistakable. Bright pink, beaded rods against a blue background. If you see that in sputum, that patient goes into isolation immediately.
The book also mentions the India ink prep for fungi. That sounded visually pretty cool.
It is. It's for Cryptococcus neoformans. This fungus has a huge, slimy capsule around it. The India ink particles are too big to get through it.
So it creates a halo.
A perfect, clear halo around the yeast cell. It's like a force field. It's instantly diagnostic.
Okay, so microscopy gives us a shape and a color. But to get a specific name, we need to grow them. Cultivation.
The gold standard. But the thing is, bacteria are incredibly picky eaters.
It's like you're their personal chef.
You really are. First, you have to get the atmosphere right. Oxygen is a huge deal. Some need it, like us. There's strict aerobes.
And some are killed by it.
The strict anaerobes. Oxygen is poison to them. You have to grow them in special oxygen-free chambers.
And then there's the food itself, the media. The book breaks it down into enriched, selective, and differential.
Right. Enriched is for the divas, the fastidious organisms. Like blood agar has sheep's blood, and lots of things grow on that. But some need more. They need chocolate agar.
Which, I was very sad to learn, has no actual chocolate.
A cruel trick, I know. It's just blood agar that's been heated. The heat pops, the red blood cells open, and releases extra nutrients.
And who needs that special treatment?
Haemophilus influenza and Neisseria gonorrhea are the classic examples. They won't grow without it.
Okay, so that's enriched. What about selective media?
Think of selective media like a bouncer at a club. It keeps the riffraff out. A great example is Thayer-Martin agar for finding gonorrhea.
Because a genital swab has tons of normal bacteria on it.
Exactly. You don't want all that normal flora overgrowing your plate. Thayer-Martin has antibiotics in it that kill all that other stuff but let the Neisseria grow. It isolates the suspect from the crowd.
Very clever. And the last type is differential media. This one is about color coding.
And the king here is MacConkey agar. It's a workhorse. It does two brilliant things at once. First, it kills most gram-positives, so if something grows, it's almost certainly gram-negative.
So it's selective first.
And then it's differential. It asks one simple question. Can you ferment lactose?
And it shows the answer with color.
With bright pink. If the bacteria, like E. coli, eats the lactose, it produces acid, and a pH indicator turns the colony pink. If it can't, like salmonella, the colony stays a boring beige color.
So one look at the plate tells you if you have a gram-negative lactose fermenter.
Which is a massive clue. You've already narrowed it down so much.
Okay, so we've got a pink colony. We know it's a gram-negative rod that ferments lactose. But is it E. coli or Klebsiella? How do we get the final name?
Now we do biochemical profiling. We look at their metabolic fingerprint by testing for specific enzymes.
The book lists some quick ones, the catalase test.
Oh yeah, you drop some hydrogen peroxide on the colony. If it bubbles, it's catalase positive. That's the test that separates staph, which bubbles, from strep, which doesn't.
Bubbles mean staph. Easy. What about coagulase?
That's the specific test for Staphylococcus aureus. It's the only major staph species that makes an enzyme that clots plasma. If your tube of plasma turns to a gel, you've found Staph aureus.
It seems like these days it's more automated, though.
Oh, for sure. We use systems like the VTech. It's like a little credit card with dozens of tiny wells, each with a different chemical test. You inoculate it, a machine reads all the color changes, and it compares that pattern to a huge database.
It finds a fingerprint match?
Precisely. It'll spit out a result like 99.8% probability of Klebsiella pneumonia. It's incredibly accurate.
So identification is sorted. But sometimes growing the bug takes way too long. That brings us to immunologic detection, serology.
Right, so this flips the script. Instead of looking for the bug, we can look for evidence of the bug, either a piece of the bug itself, an antigen, or the body's response to it, an antibody.
And the antigen tests are all about speed, right?
Totally. Think about latex agglutination. You take tiny latex beads and coat them with an antibody for, say, strep throat. You mix it with the patient's swab. If the strep antigen is there, it'll bind to the antibodies and make the beads clump together.
And you can see that with your own eyes.
In minutes. It's the basis for a lot of rapid tests.
But looking for the body's antibodies seems trickier. The book mentions a timing issue.
This is a huge concept to grasp. Your body doesn't make antibodies instantly. It takes a week, maybe two, for the levels to really ramp up. So if I test your blood on day 2 of a fever, the test might be negative even if you're definitely infected.
So a negative test doesn't rule it out.
Not early on. That's why we look for a rise in titer. We test you when you're sick, and then again 2 weeks later. If the antibody levels shot up fourfold, that's proof of a recent active infection.
And the main tool for this is the ELISA test. The book calls it a sandwich.
A molecular sandwich, yeah.
Yeah.
You have an antibody stuck to a plate. It grabs the bug's antigen for the patient's blood. Then you add a second antibody that also sticks to the antigen, and that second one has an enzyme attached to it.
So the antigen is the meat in the middle.
Exactly. Then you add a chemical, a substrate, that the enzyme changes into a color. The more antigen there is, the darker the color gets. It's super sensitive.
But even that has limits. Sometimes you have to go straight to the genetic code. Nucleic acid-based tests.
Molecular. This is the real revolution. Why wait for a culture when PCR can find the bug's DNA in a couple of hours?
PCR, polymerase chain reaction. I think of it as a biological photocopier.
That's a perfect description. You find one specific unique DNA sequence in the sample, and you make millions and millions of copies of it until it's easy to detect.
And what's the big advantage here?
Well, speed is one, but it's also great for bugs you can't grow easily, like viruses. And for really slow growers like tuberculosis, which can take 6 weeks to culture, PCR gives you an answer the same day.
And it still works even if the patient is already on antibiotics.
Yes, because the antibiotics might kill the bacteria, but the DNA evidence is still left behind at the crime scene. PCR can still find it. It's a game changer.
Okay, so we run all the tests, we have a name, we know it's E. coli, but we're not done, are we?
No, this is the most critical step for the patient. We have to do susceptibility testing. We know who the culprit is, but we don't know what its weakness is.
Because of resistance.
Because of resistance. So we have to test which drugs will actually work against this patient's specific strain.
And the classic way to do this is the Kirby-Bauer disk test.
Very visual. You spread the bacteria all over an agar plate, like a lawn. Then you drop on these little paper discs, each one soaked in a different antibiotic.
And you look for a zone of inhibition.
Right. If the antibiotic works, it kills the bacteria around the disc, leaving a clear circle, a halo. Big halo means the bug is sensitive. No halo means it's resistant.
But that's just a yes or no. The book also talks about the MIC.
The minimal inhibitory concentration. This gives you a number. It tells you exactly how much of the drug it takes to stop the bud from growing.
And why is that number so important?
Because you have to be able to achieve that concentration of the drug in the patient's body safely. If the MIC is super high, it might require a dose of antibiotic that would be toxic to the patient's kidneys or liver.
So it's a balance between killing the bug and not hurting the patient.
It's a math problem. The drug level in the blood has to stay above the MIC. The lab gives the doctor that number so they can choose the right drug at the right dose.
So let's tie it all together. It really is a logical pathway.
It's a funnel. You start broad with the patient's history, then you gram stain to get a general category. You culture it on different media to learn its habits. You run biochemical or DNA tests to get a precise name. And finally, you test its weaknesses to choose the perfect weapon.
It's an incredible process. Diagnostic microbiology isn't just naming bugs. It's about navigating that funnel to get the right treatment to the right person as fast as possible.
Exactly. It's the foundation of effective infectious disease treatment.
Looking ahead, what's the big challenge?
The arms race. As bacteria get more resistant, our diagnostics have to get faster and more detailed. We're moving towards tests that not only tell you the bug's name in an hour, but also tell you exactly which resistance genes it's carrying.
A never-ending chase. We will definitely have to tackle antibiotic resistance in a future deep dive.
Looking forward to it.
A huge thank you to everyone for listening to the deep dive. We hope this look into Chapter 4 has demystified what goes on in the microlab.
Stay curious.
And wash your hands. We'll see you next time.